Hello. Tonight, Emmanuel Macron visits the White House. Both he and Donald Trump are due to speak to the press this hour. Donald Trump said he doesn't see a problem with sending European peacekeeping troops to Ukraine. Both the UK and France will play a big role if that happens. We're due to hear from the pair shortly. We'll bring you that press conference live. On the third anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, President Zelensky's told a summit in Kyiv he hopes to finish the war this year. And Keir Starmer, who's visiting the US later this week, dials into the summit to say Donald Trump has created an opportunity, but the US is needed for peace. Meanwhile, Germany's new Chancellor in waiting is warning the United States is now indifferent to Europe's fate and has questioned the future of NATO. Plus, the MP Mike Amesbury is sent to jail for assault. He'll still be paid a salary, though, while in prison. It's Monday. I'm Sophy Ridge, live from Westminster, and this is the Politics Hub. Hello, good evening. Now, it feels like the old order is shifting. The US voted today at the UN Security Council alongside Russia, North Korea and Belarus against a resolution condemning Russian aggression in the war in Ukraine. Now, you don't need me to tell you that these are not the United States' normal allies. And we're all trying to wrap our heads around what's going on and what it means for the war in Ukraine, but also for the world, for the alliances and the institutions that have built up over the last 100 years or so and now feel shakier than ever. Trying to work out its place in all of this is Europe. Keir Starmer is going to meet Donald Trump later on this week, and today it was the turn of the French President, Emmanuel Macron, desperate to cement the alliance between the US and Europe and the military backing too. They've had a long fireside chat in front of the White House fireplace that's been the backdrop for so many of these awkward meetings. We've already had a little bit of a flavour of what's been said. This is Donald Trump being asked if he supports the idea of sending European troops to Ukraine to back a ceasefire.
European troops may go into Ukraine as peacemakers. So when the agreement is done, they can watch that everything's followed properly. I don't think that's going to be a problem. And a lot of the European countries, I don't want to speak for France, but I know that the presidents talked about doing that also. I think that'll be a very good day when we can go in as peacekeepers as opposed to what's going on right now with everybody being killed.
Will they have U.S. backing, those troops going into Ukraine? Will they have U.S. backing from U.S. troops?
Well, we're going to have a backing of some kind, and obviously the European countries are going to be involved. And I don't think you're going to need much backing. I think that's not going to be a problem. Once an agreement is signed, Russia's going to get back to its business, and Ukraine and Europe are going to get back to their business. I don't think it's going to be a problem.
Well, there'll be a lot more of that this hour. We'll have all the all-important news conference between Trump and Macron. But in the meantime, we can speak now to our US correspondent, James Matthews, who is at the White House for us. James, it's been another extraordinary day. What are your reflections on what we've seen?
Yeah, hi, Sophie. My reflection would be that Ukraine, European allies looking in on this, will not be encouraged by what they've seen thus far. I mean, the serious talks have just started. But when you look at the wider context, you get a sense of the growing distance that there is between Donald Trump's vision of the way ahead and what would suit and satisfy European countries and Ukraine about a way forward, appropriate security guarantees. In the past 2-3 hours, a number of things have happened. Up the road in New York at the United Nations, there have been resolutions passed that recognise Russia as an aggressor, that call for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukraine. The United States voted against that. It had lobbied hard with other countries to get them to encourage Ukraine to withdraw a resolution calling for those things. It just doesn't match the American vision. And indeed, US officials were telling countries this doesn't match our plan for a lasting peace. So on that alone, you have to ask yourself, well, why doesn't it match your vision of peace? Calling Russia the aggressor, fact in our eyes, and calling for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Ukrainian sovereign territory. Straightforward positions in the eyes of everybody out with this White House, frankly. And when you listen to Donald Trump in that news conference, there was nothing there amidst the generalities and the hyperbole to deliver answers on those matters and more broadly that would make European leaders sit back and think, this guy is on our side. I mean, just to take a few, on Putin, he was asked, why won't you call him a dictator? Because you did call Volodymyr Zelensky a dictator. His answer was, I don't use these words lightly. Let's see what happens. You should have seen Emmanuel Macron's face when that question was asked, the shifty eyes. And indeed, Macron was even more animated in this kind of hand on the leg at times meeting. You know, old buddies clearly like each other. Trump spoke about the money that America was piling in to Ukraine and how it wouldn't get the money back, but Europe would. There was a bit of an oh la la moment when Macron touched him on the arm and said, oh, hang on a minute, I think you'll find that 60% of the cash has come from the EU. So that gave a sense of the strained and the difficult situation, challenging dynamics of this meeting in particular, where you have a US president who just seems further away from the position that Macron and Starmer on Thursday would want to bring him back towards. Just minutes before Starmer went in, before Macron went inside the meeting, Trump was on Truth Social talking about having spoken to Putin, had serious discussions with him about economic development, clearly had a friendly chat about doing deals in future. So he himself is raising questions about loyalties, alliances, and whose interests does he hold most dearly. In terms of kind of facts, Sophie, Zelensky, he might be here next week, Trump said, talking about how this mineral deal is close, imminent. That's what the Americans reckon. But significantly, they've been banging on about this mineral deal. Come to an agreement, then we'll talk security guarantees. They have yet to talk the security guarantees that would be attached to a mineral deal. So again, a question of trust, I suppose. And Trump just seems far away from where the Americans want him and need him. Listening to Starmer this morning talking about the UK stiffening sanctions on Russia and so on, that seems a million miles away from everything we got from Donald Trump in that brief Oval Office exchange. We'll see what he has to say in a news conference in about an hour and a half's time. But it's a situation that has long needed hard questions, and it needs hard answers that Europeans, Ukrainians can look at and say, yep, that's what we need. That is our future, and that is our security. I think Donald Trump has yet to convince anybody that that's the way he's seeing things right now.
Yeah, James, when you lay it out like that, as you put it, the kind of gulf between America and Europe really does feel so stark now. Things that we see as facts, as unarguable truths, just not perceived in the same way. I guess the nub of this is Ukraine. That is the immediate impact of this. But how much do you think this is a wider shift in kind of global alliances that we're seeing play out before our eyes?
Yeah, well, that's the question, isn't it, Sophie? I mean, Ukraine clearly is the immediate priority, but in many ways, Ukraine and how that unfolds is a pivot point for the direction of the world order as we know it. The geopolitics have been upended by Donald Trump, and importantly, kind of geopolitics and the way the world interacts that have underpinned, secured a world peace stretching back to the post-Second World War period. And that is the wider, more challenging problem, the direction that Donald Trump is taking the world in general and where he sees influence in future. Interestingly, the whole United Nations machinations over the past few hours, the Americans were keen to have a resolution passed that would suit Russia and China, against the interests of Ukraine and European allies. You have to ask yourself, what were the politics at play there? There is this big discussion about Donald Trump trying to steer an order whereby the superpowers emerge as more influential, more powerful, and that's where the sphere of of strength is anchored in future. Not so much what we've had for the past, 80 years, this American economic and moral guidance that has steered and secured the peace for so long as a security guarantee, a backstop, if you like. So, yeah, there is this notion that that's the wider plan of Donald Trump. If it is, then I think everything we've seen over the past month would feed into that, quite frankly. There is the alternative notion articulated by people who've worked with Trump, been close, who have been in the room with Trump, who say, look, he's just winging it. He is making it up as he goes along. He's a businessman. For him, this is an episode of The Apprentice. He wants to be the guy in charge, the guy who collects the cash at the end of the day and hang the consequences. He's got this short-term vision that is based purely around self-interest. I think whichever version of Donald Trump you believe in, clearly it's a Donald Trump that's all about change, radical change that's happening too quickly for Macron, who's inside that meeting right now, Starmer when he comes here on Thursday, Europe, the world more broadly.
Yeah, that's it. Whatever version you get, and you're right, we still don't quite know. It's going to be pretty bumpy. Thank you very much indeed, James. Always really interesting to get your perspective. And as James was saying, we'll of course bring you that news conference between Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump as soon as it happens. Now, Keir Starmer is also preparing for his own trip to the States to meet Donald Trump this week, of course, addressing a summit in Kyiv virtually earlier today. The Prime Minister said that this is a crucial moment in the conflict as talks begin and Ukraine must have a seat at the table. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has this report.
Ukrainian soldiers training on British soil. Ever since Russia invaded its neighbour, the UK has stood with Kyiv, supporting the military effort and now trying to secure a just peace. Other leaders showing solidarity too, joining President Zelensky in Ukraine to mark the third anniversary of this war, in what's shaping up to be a big week for the future of Ukraine, Europe and this Prime Minister.
The UK is with you today and every day.
The UK stepping up military support to £4.5 billion this year and today announcing a slew of new sanctions against Russia. But the PM knows in truth Ukraine's fate rests not on him, but on what President Trump decides.
If we want peace to endure, Ukraine must have a seat at the table. And any settlement must be based on a sovereign Ukraine, backed up with strong security guarantees. The UK is ready and willing to support this with troops on the ground. And ultimately, a US backstop will be vital to deter Russia from launching another invasion in just a few years' time.
Frantic diplomacy has been going on for days now, after President Trump criticised Zelensky and appeared to parrot Putin's playbook as the post-war security pact between the US and Europe fractures. G7 leaders, including President Trump, meeting virtually today to mark the anniversary of this war, but unable to put out a statement of unity. Sources told me that the US opposed calling Russia the aggressor, leaving it to the PM to go to Washington in hope of finding common ground.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
At home pressure too, the PM being pressed to set out his timeframe on increasing defence spend.
There is already, as the government will know, a fully funded plan to get to 2.5% of GDP on defence by 2030 from the previous government. And I would strongly urge this government to at least look at a minimum plan to match that commitment. It's not a goal in itself. It's an important step on that journey to increase the strength of our defence spending.
I've been on a number of trips to the White House with successive prime ministers, but I can't remember one that feels as substantive as this. Because what's at stake are the contours of a peace deal for Ukraine that could affect the future of Europe for years to come. And when you ask people in number 10 what they're expecting, they say they honestly don't know what's in Trump's mind. So there is huge unpredictability for the Prime Minister. And with that comes jeopardy as he tries to navigate what he calls a generational moment for the UK and Europe too.
Hello. Very nice to see you.
Tonight, Keir Starmer met members of the Ukrainian community in a special reception at number 10. Warm words and handshakes here, but what awaits him in Washington is less clear in a pivotal week, not just for his premiership, but for all of us too. Beth, Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, we can talk now to Beth. I mean, we've seen the French president out there now with Donald Trump. It's Keir Starmer's big moment later this week, and that's going to be such a critical meeting, isn't it?
It's so critical, it's so pivotal, and the biggest thing about it, and you can actually see that through what's going on at the moment with Macron and Trump, it's so unpredictable. And I think what you've got in Downing Street at the moment are advisors and officials wargaming various scenarios. But the Prime Minister really is going to go in there. And as someone was saying to me today, they don't really know what they're going to find with Trump until they're face to face. So they're hoping that this moment where Starmer and Trump meet will be a moment where they can really understand where the president is coming from and then begin to act out various scenarios. They must be wargaming, if you like, in this really, really fraught time. And I think we've seen today, and you saw with James talking about what's been going on at the United Nations or the G7, allies are disunited. President Trump has come in and in the past week or two, he has ripped up the rules-based order that really has governed the relationship between the UK and European allies and NATO for 70 plus years. And now leaders are scrambling to work out how to handle that. So I think from a number 10 perspective, the first thing I'd say is that they genuinely have been pleased at what seems to be quite a warm relationship between Trump and Starmer. They've been very mindful to not poke the bear, so they don't get involved in any war of words. And they're hoping that they can persuade him on the idea of what a lasting peace deal might look like for Ukraine, why that needs US security guarantees and why actually that will make Trump look good. But there's so much jeopardy because they really don't know what they're going to get from the president and what's in his mind.
And just quickly, Beth, you say there that he's completely unpredictable, which of course is the very difficult thing that they have to deal with. But I guess the one thing you can predict is that he wants more defence spending from the UK, and that's not going to be easy, is it?
No, this is a transactional president, and one of the big asks of NATO and European allies, and it was in his first presidency, it's now ramped up, is more defence spending. Now, the UK has committed to 2.5% of GDP as a proportion of defence spend but Starmer has not given a timeline for that. So there's a big question about whether or not he'll commit to the end of the decade by 2030. Trump is publicly pressing NATO allies for 5% of defence spending. Why? Because people think actually he'd settle for 3%. So you ask for what you're not going to get to move them. So there's lots of discussion about whether or not one of the offers that will be made at the White House later this week might be that Starmer says something publicly on when the time frame is to hit that target. But they've also got this strategic defence view, and they've been hiding behind that because we've all been pressing them on defence spend. Look, another element of this visit to the White House, although we are focusing on Ukraine, it's the anniversary of Russia's invasion, is economy. That is another second strand for the Prime Minister. He doesn't want tariffs. He wants to get into a process where the UK can deepen economic ties with the US. They're not looking at a full-blown free trade deal, not least because it might not be doable and it could take years to come about, but can they have targeted deals in some sectors and areas? And can they put off any threat of tariffs? And look, Sophie, if you think about it and we zoom out to what is Keir Starmer trying to do, he's promised the country a decade of national renewal. That is predicated on an economy growing. Continued conflict in Europe doesn't help that. Pressure on defence spending doesn't help that. bad relations with our second biggest trading partner doesn't help that. So this isn't just about foreign policy and Europe, this is also about his domestic agenda and how he can come to some accommodation with Trump. So it's a huge week for him. And I think there's a big question about whether Starmer can meet the moment. And if he does, it will be a big win for him, but it's a big if.
Yeah, it really is. Beth, thank you very much indeed. Beth Rigby, our political editor there. Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to the former Armed Forces Minister, I should say, James Heappey. Let's have a listen. Well, unless you're expert lip readers, you probably couldn't hear a word of that. Don't worry, your TV's not broken. We will try and fix it and bring it to you as soon as we can. And also just to remind you, of course, that we are awaiting that news conference between Emmanuel Macron, the French president, and also Donald Trump. When that happens, when they step up in front of the podium, we'll bring it to you there. Well, President Trump's recent actions seem to have given Moscow renewed confidence in their so-called special operation in Ukraine, but some Russian families who've lost loved ones say they've paid a heavy price for the 3-year war. Our Moscow correspondent Ivor Bennett reports.
Around Moscow, you see the word victory. Victory will be ours, this sign reads. But do peace talks still count as a win? The Kremlin's war in Ukraine wasn't supposed to last this long. 3 years that have seen Russia itself invaded. But the mood in Moscow is triumphant. Relations with the US are thawing and currents shifting in Russia's favor. Nothing will feel like a victory for Yelena, though, no matter how the war ends. Her 18-year-old son, Valentin, was killed in Russia's Kursk region in September, soon after Ukraine's incursion there.
Sometimes I sit and think who my grandchildren could have been. It's impossible to live like this. It's very hard for me to be without him. I still wait for him to come back home every day, even though I saw his body. I still can't believe it. I want all mothers to see their children come home.
Yelena made this video in memory of Valentin, who she says was excited to do his military service. The Kremlin promised conscripts wouldn't be involved in combat, but after being sent to the border, the war came to him.
It should be specially trained people there, not children. They were taken from home, from a mother's nest, and brought to some unknown place where there is shooting. What kind of warrior is he? He's not a warrior.
She even wrote to Vladimir Putin, asking for an explanation. But no reply. All she has instead is a grave and her grief.
Russia doesn't publish its casualty figures, and it's only when you come to a place like this that you get a sense of the scale of the losses. The military graves are the ones marked out by flags, and there are dozens and dozens of them. And this is just one cemetery in one town in one region.
Back in Moscow, honours for those who do return, and an unwavering belief that Russia won't be defeated.
The victory will be significant. The main thing is for this to end quickly. But in any case, we will make every effort to ensure that victory is still ours. No one will take it away from us.
Vladimir Putin appears increasingly confident too. On Defender of the Fatherland Day, a focus on Russia's losses, but it seems gains are now within reach. Ivor Bennett, Sky News, Moscow.
Well, we can go to Moscow now and speak to our correspondent, Ivor Bennett. Ivor, how do you think it will have gone down in Russia to see the US effectively siding with it at the UN?
Hi, Sophie. I think they will be overjoyed, to put it bluntly. I think they'll be very pleased indeed, because it is just the latest example of things now going their way. I mean, I think it's important to remember on this third anniversary of the Kremlin's invasion that its so-called special military operation was never supposed to last this long. It was supposed to be an outright victory in a matter of weeks. And Russia doesn't like to draw attention to the fact that things haven't necessarily gone their way, or it hasn't gone to plan on the battlefield always. So there haven't been any events here marking this anniversary. But as I say, on the negotiating stance and on the negotiating table, things definitely are going their way, with Donald Trump seemingly siding with Russia. And these developments in New York at the UN are just the latest extraordinary example of that, with the US voting alongside the likes of Russia, Belarus, North Korea, to vote against this resolution condemning Russian aggression, calling for a de-escalation, and reaffirming a commitment to a just and lasting peace in Ukraine. And you wouldn't think it that controversial, but clearly, I mean, it says a lot about the shifting geopolitical sands, doesn't it? And I think it's just worth recapping at this point how much has gone in Russia's favour in the last 10 days or so since that phone call between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. So we've had the two sides, Russia and America, speaking face to face. We've had this seemingly the start of a reset of relations between Washington and Moscow. The US signalling potentially the lifting of sanctions and potentially the readmission of Russia into the G7 to make it the G8. Europe and Ukraine, meanwhile, have been sidelined. The US is ignoring their requests and whilst also appearing sympathetic to Russia's red lines. And then on top of all that, you've got Donald Trump, the White House leader, now echoing the Kremlin's talking points, labelling Zelensky a dictator, but then tonight refusing to call Vladimir Putin one as well. So it's really quite remarkable. And as I say, the Kremlin will be very happy indeed with how things have changed in the last week and a half or so.
Thank you very much indeed. Ava Bennett there, reporting from Moscow for us. Well, just before we came on air, I spoke to the former Armed Forces Minister, James Heappey, on the anniversary of the beginning of the invasion of Ukraine. But of course, we did also speak about the latest from the States. And thank you so much for being on the programme.
Thanks for having me.
It feels like things are moving very, very quickly at the moment. What's your reflections on what we're seeing in the States, in Ukraine, in the globe?
So, I mean, I'm watching with a sense of despair and growing gloom because I sort of feel like the world order is changing in front of our very eyes. This afternoon, we've seen a vote in the United Nations where a motion that's supported by all of the European Union and the UK and Australia has been voted against by China, Russia, Iran, Belarus, Eritrea, and the United States of America. And that's something I just didn't think I would see. But amidst all of that, I mean, now as a sort of commentator, freed of all the responsibilities of government, I can just wallow in misery. But for those who are still in government, what an incredibly challenging time to be navigating global affairs. And all politics aside, I think that Keir Starmer is on his way to one of the most consequential summits between a UK Prime Minister and a US President for generations. And I want him to be successful, really want him to be successful.
And how should he navigate it? Because you're right, it is an absolute tightrope to walk. There may not be a perfect solution here, to be honest, if we're really honest with ourselves. But how do you think he should navigate that meeting with Donald Trump?
I think both he and Macron have to go into their meetings with a very clear-eyed view of what the strategic objective is. Even if, amidst all of the noise that surrounds their meeting, there's a whole load of stuff that makes them really uncomfortable. The things that Trump's been saying, the things he stands for, the threats he's making to Europe and to Ukraine and whatever else. What they've got to go and do is almost ignore all of that and speak to Trump in first principles terms about the US's role in Europe, the fact that European security without that US backstop, that US guarantee, is significantly degraded, and that has a cost to the United States.
But that's a problem, isn't it? Because if you take him at his word, he just doesn't believe that. He thinks that Europe's been freeloading off the US, and now's a time for them, or us, if you like, to step up.
And in that respect, he's right. You know, all the way through the first Trump presidency, he was saying that that Europeans are not spending enough on defence. For 2 years of his candidature, he's been clean on it. Oh, and by the way, you know, Democrat and Republican presidents since the late 80s have been saying that, you know, Europe is taking peace and security increasingly for granted. So there's no challenge there. He's right, and he will hold the mirror up to us in a way that is uncomfortable and should force us to react in terms of the way that we invest in our defence and security. But the other part of it is twofold. Firstly, Trump is a second-term president. He's not after re-election, he's after legacy. And does he really want the sort of the sort of defeat of the West, the defeat of Western values to be on his watch? Is
so
that
you think that's where we're at? You think that the defeat of the West and the defeat of Western values is the reality?
I think that there is a trajectory from this moment that could be exactly that. You know, the triumph of authoritarianism, a return to national self-interest in global affairs rather than any sense of collectivism. So I'm not saying we're there yet, but I think that we could be at a moment of that gravity. So is that what he wants his legacy to be? But secondly, just reminding him of the United States geography. Yes, the US is a continent in its own right, thousands of miles from anywhere. But if Trump and those around him fear a confrontation with China, the idea that that happens exclusively in the Pacific and that there's no challenge to the US eastern seaboard from China itself or through Russia, who will increasingly become a client of China over the next decade or so, that doesn't stand scrutiny. So the US is always going to have an interest in Euro-Atlantic security, no matter how much it tries to focus on the Pacific. And I think that's a really important thing to remind Trump of in this week.
You started the interview talking about the kind of the big changes that we're seeing, the kind of huge undercurrents of things that have pinned our geopolitics for so long, starting to fray and fracture. Do you think some of those institutions are on their way out? I'm thinking about NATO, where Donald Trump has talked about, you know, NATO not being backing peacekeeping troops in Ukraine, or the UN. You mentioned the vote today with the US siding with some very unnatural, unlikely allies there. Are these big institutions no more?
Well, I mean, I hope not, because I think they genuinely still have utility. And in many ways, the UN particularly has evolved, and not in a way that most Western politicians would like. You know, China is very influential across all the committees and groupings of the United Nations already. But the UN has continued to, you know, hold its place in the world. And NATO, it definitely must endure, but not in such a way as just assumes that the US will contribute the lion's share. I think the Europeans have to view it as a transaction, that European investment in their own defence is rewarded by US continued involvement and commitment. But I think the stakes are high. You know, there is that danger that an isolationist US, ever less bothered by global affairs and ever more focused on its own prosperity and its own internal politics, you know, causes those sorts of institutions to weaken. And that bothers me enormously, because, you know, the last 120 years have really been defined by a rules-based international system of varying forms, League of Nations, followed by the United Nations, forged on the back of the horrors of the First and Second World War, and with a sort of liberal democratic free market ideology at its heart. And the idea that we're sort of reaching a point where those ideological, philosophical norms are seriously up for change is pretty sobering.
On NATO, you've said before that you think there should be a path for Ukraine to join NATO. Obviously, Donald Trump disagrees with you. I guess my question is, you know, NATO is a nuclear alliance at its heart. Is it really sensible to have Ukraine and Russia both backed effectively by nuclear weapons? Is that not putting us closer to a nuclear war?
Well, maybe. I mean, first of all, I think NATO, first and foremost, is an alliance founded on collective defence, and the idea that greater security comes from pooling sovereignty and agreeing to fight for one another if one of you is attacked. Yes, there is a nuclear underpinning of that, but we should be clear on what the risks are of a peace in Ukraine, and it's a peace in inverted commas in Ukraine that doesn't have that sort of security guarantee, be that NATO membership or some other sort of EU or European security force with a US backstop, Putin may well come again. You know, the war didn't start 3 years ago today. The war started in 2014 when Putin invaded Crimea and Donetsk. He then reheated the war 3 years ago today to take the rest of the Donbass, and if he had had his way, pretty much all of Ukraine. The peace that may come, if not guaranteed in such a robust way, because the Minsk agreements did not succeed in deterring Putin from coming back from more, means that we just end up with more violence, more death, and that violence and death moving ever closer to the NATO border. So I think that guaranteeing Ukraine's peace in a far more robust way than we did in the second Minsk agreement is absolutely necessary.
Just finally, how much does the UK need to spend on defence and how quickly?
At least 3% by the end of the decade. 2.5, 2.6 now, just to stand still. At least 3% by the end of the decade. And I think an actual quite a neat way of calling Trump's bluff. And 0.1 sounds very little to you and I and to your viewers, but it's actually quite a lot of money. But actually a commitment to spend around what the US does, 3.2, 3.3%, would be a really good way of saying to the US public that actually the UK is leading in Europe. The UK, this is no betrayal of Brexit. The UK needs its relationship with France, Germany, the European Union and other European allies now more than it has done for 30 or 40 years. But it also must remain that bridge between Europe and the United States. And the way that we achieve a hearing in Washington is by being the first to meet Trump's expectations around what should be spent on defence and security.
OK, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Well, this is a scene right now in the White House where you can see the journalists gathered, waiting to hear from Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron, the US flags and the French flags side by side there. It is a critical meeting. It's going to be a fascinating news conference. Two men who, you get the sense that they get on, that they have a relationship, that they like each other, but they're quite far apart when it comes to Ukraine. And really, what happens in this press conference will be a reflection of the wider tensions, not only over Ukraine, but more widely between the US and between Europe, and whether those two continents can find a way through together. We'll bring you that, of course, just as soon as it begins. Coming up next on the Politics Hub, in the meantime, Labour calls for a new MP for Runcorn and Helsby after Mike Amesbury is jailed for punching a man in the street. Stay with us.
I'm James Matthews and I'm Sky's US correspondent, based here in Washington, D.C. Do you fear a fourth indictment? Does your government owe an apology to the British home children?
Great to see you.
Does your government owe them an apology? The fact that they were intercepted, does that indicate a military weakness on the part of Iran?
No.
Free, wherever you get your news. There's no doubting the strength of this hurricane as it roars through. You can feel a devastating power. It had been a difficult night in a deadly storm.
Bang, bang. You can hear it hitting the windows.
Our houses are okay.
It's depressing.
As bad as all of this is, it could have been much worse. Today, this land they call sacred is at the heart of America's electric car revolution.
To me, it's a sacred ground.
The white gold rush is a race that Biden doesn't want to lose. I've covered some of the biggest stories in the world. Donald Trump, 45th President of the United States, it would appear is about to learn his fate.
Escort coming out!
San Quentin houses America's largest death row. They rarely allow cameras onto the condemned block.
James Matthews, Sky News. I want to be treated equally like everyone else.
It's one step closer to getting out, to getting off death row.
Sky News. Get the full story first. Mr. Trump, James Matthews from Sky News.
Hey, James.
You're diminished by claims that you're a racist.
Question?
Mr. Musk, has your ignorance and ego cost Ukrainian lives? Vladimir Putin calls you outstanding. What do you call him, sir?
He's from Sky News. He's from Sky News. He's entitled to ask me questions.
Weeknights on Sky News.
This is your chance. Tell people. Welcome to the Politics Hub.
Our police force has apologised. If you want to find out about Grimsby, you come to the docks. I'm live in Jerusalem.
Are you not concerned that that could lead to all-out war?
Hello there, good evening. There are fears of an upsurge in violence. What's at stake here?
You are watching the press preview, a first look at the front pages as they arrive.
Hello, welcome back. We are, of course, still awaiting the news conference between Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron. But while we do, back here in the UK, a suspended Labour MP has been jailed for 10 weeks after punching a man in the street. Mike Amesbury had admitted assaulting 45-year-old Paul Fellows back in October. And now Labour has called for a new MP in the constituency of Runcorn and Helsby, as our political correspondent Liz Bates reports.
Here to face the consequences, Mike Amesbury, the MP for Runcorn and Helsby, arriving at Chester Magistrates Court today, where his political status didn't afford him any special treatment.
Good morning. Mike, I'll just go through, OK? I've got to pass here.
As he was handed a 10-week prison sentence, 40% to be served with a further 12 months on licence, bail was refused. This, caught on CCTV, a 2 a.m. confrontation. The man who approached him, Paul Fellows, was angry about the closure of a local bridge. Then suddenly, a punch to the head. The judge said only the intervention of others had prevented the injuries from being much worse.
And you won't threaten the MP ever again, will you?
Oh, is it Mike? Is it Mike?
Yes.
He's the local MP, Jono.
Oh, yeah.
Get him on camera. Get him on camera, Jono. He's the local MP.
This is the very spot where the incident happened, in the small town of Frodsham in Cheshire, where Mike Amesbury not only lives but has served as the MP for 8 years. But that could be about to come to an end, because it's now very likely this will trigger a recall petition. If 10% of his constituents sign it, that will force a by-election. He could be out of office within a matter of months. It was only 6 months ago that people here voted for him to be their Labour MP. So what do they make of it all?
Yeah, I think 10 weeks is probably about right. I think that he's well deserved.
And do you think he should stay on as the MP?
No, I don't think so. I think that should be it for now.
If he's allowed to stand, then yeah, because he's done a good job so far.
Do you think?
Yeah, he's just let himself down by that one incident.
A prison van is not how any MP wants to end their political journey. Mike Amesbury, likely to appeal today's sentencing and keep fighting for his freedom and his career, will hope it's not over just yet. Liz Bates, Sky News, Cheshire.